The desert was flat, too flat. Miles of open ground baked under the sun, cleared by Persian hands so their king could crush a legend in full view of the world. 200,000 men stood for empire. 47,000 stood for a boy. When the horns sounded, the earth trembled with hooves and faith. But Alexander of Macedon didn't fight the way kings were supposed to. He bent the line. He lured the weight of Persia outward, until the gap appeared. And when it did, he rode straight through the heart of it. By noon, the sand was red. By dusk, an empire was gone. This was Gaugamela, the day geometry killed 1,000,000 men. The dawn of October 1st, 331 BC broke over the Mesopotamian plain like a blade. The ground shimmered beneath a thin mist, smooth and flat as if the gods themselves had scraped it clean for war. There were no hills, no trees, no shadows, nothing that could hide weakness or deceit. It was the kind of ground where numbers ruled, and King Darius III of Persia believed numbers were his destiny. He had spent weeks preparing it, ordering his engineers to level every bump and fill every hollow so that his chariots could run unhindered. He stood at the center of an army that stretched farther than sight could reach. Infantry from Babylon and Susa, cavalry from Bactria and Media, archers from every province of the empire. There were scythed chariots lined up in rows, their blades glittering like teeth, and behind them, elephants armored in bronze. Nearly 200,000 men gathered beneath banners painted with suns, lions, and the fire symbols of Persia. To Darius, this was the end of Alexander. The boy king from the west had come too far, stretched too thin, and would finally be crushed beneath the weight of civilization itself. Across the open plain, the Macedonian camp stirred in the half-light. Alexander was 25, his armor dulled by dust, his eyes bright as if he'd slept under thunder instead of stars. His army was small, no more than 47,000 in all, and half of them exhausted from years of marching and fighting. They had chased Darius across rivers and deserts, fought through scorching heat and disease. And yet, they stood calm. Every man there understood that retreat meant death. Alexander's advisors begged him to attack by night, to use stealth and confusion against such overwhelming force. He refused. "I steal nothing in darkness," he said. "Let them see who beats them." He wanted Darius to watch every movement, every feint, every collapse of confidence. When the sun rose, the world became metal. The light hit Persian armor and turned the horizon into a field of mirrors. Alexander rode along his line inspecting his men, the phalanx with their sarissas, 16-foot spears forming a moving forest of iron, the Greek hoplites with short swords and round shields, the archers crouched behind stakes. On the wings stood his cavalry, the Thessalians on the left and his companions on the right. The companions were nobles and veterans, the hammer of his strategy, always positioned where he could lead them himself. The formation he built wasn't straight. It leaned. The right wing angled forward slightly, oblique to the Persian line, as if drawn by accident. Darius saw it from his chariot and assumed the Macedonian flank was exposed, that the boy king was uncertain, already trying to avoid confrontation. That was the first lie Alexander fed him. Persian drums rolled like thunder. Darius raised his hand, and the plain came alive. The scythed chariots surged forward, horses foaming, blades spinning from the hubs of their wheels. Behind them marched the immortal guard, shields high, chanting prayers to Ahura Mazda. The ground shook under the weight of the charge. Alexander waited. He didn't flinch as the chariots bore down. At the last instant, he signaled. The front ranks of his phalanx opened narrow lanes, perfectly timed gaps that swallowed the incoming chariots. The vehicles rushed through into nothing, caught in a maze of javelins and swords, horses impaled or panicked, drivers dragged from their seats. The lanes closed again as if the ground itself had devoured the machines. Darius's grand opening vanished in a heartbeat. The Persian cavalry followed. Thousands of horsemen fanned out across the plain in glittering waves. The air turned brown with dust. Alexander kept his line steady, letting the phalanx creep forward, spears leveled, shields overlapping. He moved constantly, never commanding from a distance, but weaving between ranks on horseback, shouting encouragement, his presence tightening discipline like a drawn bow. On his left, the Thessalian cavalry engaged Persian horsemen, trading space for time, drawing them wider. On the right, Alexander's angled formation continued to drift sideways, step by step. It was imperceptible at first, a subtle slide across the plain that looked like retreat. Darius's left wing moved to counter it, sending more and more cavalry to trap the Macedonians. What the Persians didn't see was that they were chasing a phantom, stretching their line, thinner with every gallop. Alexander wasn't retreating. He was painting a circle. The sun rose higher. The temperature climbed and the dust turned the air to haze. The sound of hooves and metal was constant, drowning all thought. Alexander looked to his right and saw what he needed: space. The Persians had followed his drift far enough that their center now gaped open like a wound. He turned to his companion cavalry, about 1,000 men in all, their armor gold-edged, their horses restless. "Follow me," he said. No flourish, no speech. They had heard it too many times to need one. He pulled on the reins, turned sharply left, and charged straight into the heart of the Persian line. It was the moment the whole battle pivoted. The wedge of Macedonian cavalry slammed into the seam between the Persian guard and the central infantry. The impact was catastrophic. Spears splintered, horses collided with shields. For an instant, dust hid everything. Then the Persian center folded inward. Darius, from his chariot, saw confusion ripple through his ranks like wind through grain. Officers shouted contradictory orders. Some tried to wheel to face the new attack. Others pushed forward into the phalanx, breaking cohesion. Darius ordered his charioteers to drive forward to rally them, but the sand was too soft, the ground too uneven. The great golden chariot began to bog down. His guards clustered around him, shouting for retreat. Meanwhile, on the Macedonian left, Parmenian's forces were nearly overwhelmed. Persian cavalry had finally realized the trap and swung back toward the center, hammering at the Macedonian rear. But before they could exploit it, Alexander's charge had already ripped through the heart of the Persian army. When his wedge broke through, he didn't stop. He turned right again, forming a pivot that smashed into the Persians attacking Parmenion. It was geometry, turned into slaughter. Every line of the Macedonian army bent, but none broke. The oblique advance had turned into a perfect encirclement. The Persians had more men, but nowhere to move them. In the chaos, Darius tried to rally what remained of his guard. He stood in his chariot surrounded by the noise of dying horses, the crash of armor, the endless swirl of dust. For a heartbeat, he saw Alexander through the smoke, bareheaded, charging with his cavalry, spear raised high, eyes fixed on him. The great king hesitated. His charioteer was struck by a spear and collapsed. The horses panicked, the chariot lurched sideways, and Darius was thrown to the ground. His officers dragged him onto a spare mount and fled the field. When his soldiers saw the royal banner disappearing into the distance, the entire army unraveled. The battle turned into flight. Alexander didn't pursue immediately. He knew victory wasn't about the kill, but about the collapse. He rallied his cavalry, regrouped the phalanx, and reformed the line facing west to catch any counterattack. When none came, he advanced steadily through the wreckage of the Persian host. Bodies lay in patterns of sand and armor, the aftermath of mathematics. Tens of thousands were dead. Thousands more fled without weapons or direction. The plain that had been prepared to guarantee Persian victory had instead become their grave. When he finally reached Darius's abandoned chariot, Alexander dismounted. The golden harness still glimmered in the sun, splattered with sand and blood. A Persian bow lay half-buried nearby, snapped clean in two. Alexander looked at the banner fluttering weakly beside it, the symbol of an empire that had ruled for centuries, and simply said, "The world is smaller now." Then he turned to his officers. "Find Darius," he ordered, "alive if possible." They never would. That day, on the open plain of Gaugamela, Alexander broke the spine of Persia. His army had done the impossible. A smaller force had destroyed the largest standing army on earth by turning precision into art. He hadn't relied on numbers or fortune. He had used space itself as a weapon. Every movement had been part of the design, the angled advance, the hidden drift, the timed charge. It wasn't brute force, it was orchestration. When the dust finally settled and the moans of the dying faded into the wind, the young king, who had crossed from Macedonia to the edge of Asia, stood at the center of a new world. That night, Alexander didn't sleep in a tent. He slept under the stars, using his cloak as a blanket, listening to the distant fires crackle across the plain. He didn't smile. Victory had a weight, and even he could feel it pressing down. The men feasted, singing songs of home, of triumph. But Alexander stared into the darkness beyond the flames. Somewhere out there, Darius was running. Somewhere out there, the empire still breathed, weak, fractured, but alive. And Alexander wasn't finished until the chase ended. The world, after all, could always be made smaller. When dawn returned to the field of Gaugamela, the wind had changed. The smell of smoke and iron hung heavy over the plain where the world had shifted hands. Bodies were frozen mid-motion, the sand hard and black where blood had soaked it. The Persians who had survived the night hid among the dead, waiting for a chance to crawl away before Macedonian patrols found them. The silence didn't feel like peace. It felt like disbelief. Alexander rose before sunrise. He rode alone through the wreckage, his horse stepping over shields and spears half buried in sand. He said nothing. Every so often he dismounted to study the ground, as though searching for something invisible, some hidden sign that the war had truly ended. His generals followed in silence. They were victorious, but none of them smiled. They had seen what victory cost. The battlefield stretched for miles. Here and there, Persian banners lay folded under bodies, their golden embroidery dulled by dust. Chariots had splintered into skeletal frames. Horses lay in tangled heaps beside broken wheels, and at the center of it all, the king's golden chariot still stood where it had fallen, half sunk in sand, a throne turned coffin. The empire had been cracked open by one morning's geometry. Alexander stopped beside the wreck. "He fled east," he said softly. His eyes tracked the faint trail of hoofprints stretching toward the horizon. "But he's not gone yet." His officers nodded, knowing what came next. Gaugamela was not an ending. It was a door. That afternoon, the Macedonians buried their dead first. They built small cairns of stone, marking each with a spear and shield. The Persians were left to the vultures. For every soldier Alexander lost, 10 Persians had fallen, and still, it didn't feel like triumph. Victory was becoming too familiar, something practiced, rehearsed. When the last funeral pyre burned, Alexander called his captains together. His voice was low, but there was no mistaking the edge in it. "We've broken their army," he said, "but not their will. Darius breathes, and as long as he breathes, they will call this a delay, not defeat." No one argued. They knew his obsession. They also knew it was the only reason they were still alive. The march east began at dusk. The Macedonian army moved like a single organism, tight, fast, unstoppable. Scouts returned daily with word of Darius, always just beyond reach, always escaping by a day or two. He fled with his royal guard, burning towns behind him to slow pursuit. But fear spread faster than a fire. Every city Alexander approached opened its gates. Babylon, once the beating heart of Persia, surrendered without a fight. The priests came out barefoot, carrying torches and gifts. The people lined the streets, throwing flowers into the path of the conqueror they had been taught to hate. Alexander rode through Babylon's gates as if entering a temple. The city glowed under torchlight, the walls painted with stories of kings long dead. He didn't plunder, he didn't kill. Instead, he sat on the throne of Darius, but not as a barbarian. He adopted Persian customs, wearing their robes, accepting their courtiers. Some of his officers grumbled at that, whispering that he was becoming what he'd destroyed. But Alexander was thinking beyond victory. He was building something no one else could see. A world that wasn't Greek or Persian, but both. Still, his thoughts never left Darius. Reports said the great king had fled toward Ecbatana, gathering the remnants of his army for one last stand. Alexander didn't rest. He divided his forces, driving them across deserts and mountains to close the distance. Days blurred into weeks, weeks into months. His men followed him because they couldn't imagine doing anything else. They called him the Spear of Zeus, half joke, half truth. But they also whispered about his eyes, how one seemed to burn brighter than the other, as though a god was looking through him. When they reached Ecbatana, they found nothing but abandoned camps and the fading scent of smoke. Darius had fled again, deeper into the east toward the lands of Bactria. His generals had begun to turn on him, each plotting to trade loyalty for survival. The empire was eating itself alive. One night, as Alexander's army camped in the shadow of a ruined fortress, a Persian noble arrived under flag of truce. He bowed low, trembling, and laid a blood-stained cloak before the Macedonian king. It belonged to Darius. Alexander said nothing for a long time. Finally, he asked, "How?" The man told him. Darius's own satrap, Bessus, had betrayed him. He had stabbed the great king and left him bleeding in a wagon, hoping to deliver his body to Alexander in exchange for mercy. But when Macedonian scouts found the wagon, Darius was still alive. He had pulled the blade from his own chest and tried to stand. When they reached him, he fell to his knees and whispered through blood, "Tell your king I gave him my throne." Then he was gone. Alexander stared at the cloak for a long time. Then he ordered a royal funeral for the man who had tried to destroy him. He covered Darius's body with his own robe and buried him under a mound of Persian soil. "He was still a king," he said. The soldiers who had once cursed Darius lowered their heads. The man they followed was no longer just a general. He was something else, something older, heavier. From that day, Alexander began to change. The pursuit had ended, but the hunger didn't fade. With Darius dead, he no longer had an enemy, only an idea, an empire that refused to have an edge. He pushed east again, across lands no Greek had seen, where mountains split the sky and rivers cut through jungles. He called it conquest. His men called it madness. At night he studied maps by firelight, tracing rivers with his finger. His commanders begged him to stop, to return home as the greatest conqueror in history. He laughed. "Home," he said. "The world is home." But not all followed. The veterans, hardened by a decade of war, began to break under the weight of endless victory. They had marched from the Aegean to the edge of the known earth, fought more battles than they could remember, and buried friends in every country. Now they wanted to go back. Alexander's eyes hardened when they spoke. "You are soldiers of Macedon," he said. "We were born for more than rest." By the time they reached the mountains of the Hindu Kush, the army was half its original size. Frostbite and exhaustion claimed more men than enemy blades. Yet Alexander pressed on, chasing the horizon. He had started as a king, seeking vengeance, but now he marched like a god, testing creation. Wherever he went, cities fell, kings bent the knee, and temples added his name to their prayers. The men began to whisper stories. Some said he couldn't die, others said he already had, and the figure leading them was a spirit bound to conquest. The truth was simpler. He was just a man who didn't know how to stop. News of Darius's betrayal and death spread back to the west like a contagion. In Persia, nobles swore loyalty to Alexander, calling him King of Kings. In Greece, philosophers argued whether he was still human. In Egypt, priests built temples to his image, carving him with the horns of a god. And across Asia, caravans carried his banners as symbols of inevitability. Yet for all the glory, something in him dimmed. He had no enemy left to measure himself against. The thrill of strategy, the heartbeat of the battlefield, was gone. The only thing left to conquer was silence. He began to drink more, to test the limits of his own myth. His old friends, men who had once bled for him without question, started to look at him differently. They saw the distance growing between the man and the legend. One night after a feast in Babylon, he stared into a polished bowl of wine and saw his reflection shimmer like a ghost. "What's left?" he murmured. No one answered. The next morning, he climbed the walls of the city and watched the sunrise over the Euphrates. The river caught the light and turned to gold. In that glow, he saw both the beginning and the end of everything he'd built. He had conquered an empire that had lasted for centuries and replaced it with a vision no one fully understood. Yet even he knew what history would forget: that victory is never clean, never final, never free. Below him, the banners of Macedonia and Persia hung side by side, their colors blending in the wind. To the soldiers below, it looked like unity. To Alexander, it looked like balance, fragile, momentary, and destined to break. He turned away from the sunrise and whispered to himself, "The world is smaller now, but it's still not enough." The summer heat in Babylon pressed down like a sentence. The palace Alexander had claimed from Darius shimmered in the air, its marble floors slick with humidity, its corridors echoing with footsteps of attendants afraid to speak above a whisper. The empire that had once been a dream was now a burden sitting on his shoulders. His generals, men who had crossed deserts and rivers for him, waited outside the audience chamber, each carrying petitions from provinces that no longer understood who ruled them. To the east, revolts flared. To the west, governors hoarded tribute. Alexander ignored it all. He sat on the throne of the great king, bare-chested, the crown set carelessly beside him, staring at a map that no longer had blank spaces. There was nothing left to cross. The rivers, the mountains, the deserts, all had been measured, named, claimed. The map had become a mirror, and in it, he saw himself reflected across every border, a figure so large that even he could no longer see where it ended. When Hephaestion died, the man who had been his shadow through every campaign, something inside Alexander cracked. For days he refused food. He wandered the halls at night, barefoot, torchlight flickering over the walls. Servants whispered that he had stopped sleeping, that he spoke to Hephaestion's ghost as if issuing orders. When he finally appeared before his men, he was thinner, paler, eyes ringed in darkness. He ordered a state funeral on a scale no one had ever seen. An empire mourning one man. The flames burned for days, smoke blotting out the sun. After that, the army no longer recognized their king. He wore Persian robes, demanded divine honors, and spent more time consulting priests than commanders. The same man who had once refused to fight in darkness now seemed to live inside it. He built cities with his name on them, one after another, across lands that had never asked for them. Alexandria in Egypt, Alexandria in Bactria, Alexandria near the Indus, each a monument to motion, proof that he couldn't stop. When his officers protested, he dismissed them with the calm of a man who had already outgrown the living. "You think conquest is victory," he told them. "It's not. Conquest is the test. Rule is the answer." But there was no answer. There was only expansion, forward, always forward. His men grew restless, homesick, mutinous. They had followed him to the end of the world and found there was no end. In India, the monsoon rain drowned the will of even the bravest. They saw elephants tearing through their ranks, arrows darkening the air, and they realized they were no longer fighting empires, they were fighting distance itself. At the Hyphasis River, his army stopped. They refused to march farther. No speeches, no promises, no threats could move them. They had bled too much, buried too many, seen too far. Alexander rode down the line, his horse splashing through the shallows, trying to meet their eyes. No one raised a cheer, no one raised a spear. The silence was heavier than any shield. He turned back toward his tent and didn't emerge for 3 days. When he did, he looked 10 years older. "We return," he said quietly. The words tasted like defeat. The march back west broke them differently. The deserts of Gedrosia took more men than the Persian army ever had. Sandstorms swallowed columns whole. Waterskins turned to dust in their hands. Those who survived stumbled into Babylon, half ghosts, half legends. The empire welcomed them with parades and flowers. But there was no glory left in the faces of men who had seen the edges of the world and found them empty. Alexander returned sick. The fevers came in waves, heat, then chills, then silence. Some said it was poison. Others said it was exhaustion, or the gods reclaiming what they had lent him. He drank to numb it, but wine only fed the fire. Still, he summoned his generals, spreading a new map before them. "There," he whispered, pointing south toward Arabia. "The next campaign." They exchanged glances. None of them believed he would live to see it. The night before he died, the city held its breath. Outside the palace, soldiers gathered with torches, waiting for a sign, any word that their king would rise again. Inside, the air was thick with incense and fear. Alexander lay on his bed, eyes half open, staring at the ceiling where faint torchlight danced across carved stars. His voice was barely a whisper. "Who inherits?" someone asked. The answer came like a sigh. "To the strongest." He exhaled once more and didn't draw another breath. The empire he left behind tore itself apart before the funeral smoke cleared. Generals carved it into kingdoms, each claiming a piece of the world he had built. The banner of Macedonia fell, replaced by dozens of new ones, each bearing the shadow of his name. His cities survived, scattered across continents. But his vision, one world, one rule, died with him. And yet, even in death, his legend grew. Historians wrote of him as a god. Poets called him destiny made flesh. Soldiers carried his story across oceans. Every conqueror after him measured their ambition by his. Caesar carried his image. Napoleon studied his tactics, and in every war that followed, someone whispered the same words: "Be like Alexander." But none were. They could imitate his strategy, his discipline, his fearlessness, but not the thing that drove him, the thing that burned behind his eyes, that hunger to keep moving, to never let stillness win. Centuries later, travelers in Babylon still visited the ruined palace. They said the air there was different, heavy, electric. They said that if you stood where his throne had been, you could still feel it. That invisible pull toward the horizon, that quiet command to keep going. The wind over the Euphrates carried his name like dust. No one ever found his tomb. Some said it sank into the desert. Others said the earth itself swallowed him. Perhaps that was fitting. A man who refused to stop couldn't belong to any one place. In the end, history remembers him as a conqueror, a visionary, a tyrant, a god, all of it true. But the soldiers who had followed him from Greece to the edge of the known world remembered something simpler. They remembered the mornings before battle, when he would ride the line, meeting every man's gaze, and say nothing, just nod once, as if to promise that the impossible could still be done. They remembered the way the world seemed to hold its breath when he moved. They remembered that for one generation, under one man, the earth itself had felt smaller. And they remembered the silence that followed him, the silence that comes only when there's no one left to chase. History calls it victory, but to the men who walked beside him, it was something else entirely. It was the moment they realized that no one, not even Alexander, could outrun the weight of the world.